What was the first major news story you remember as a kid? Sort of localish, but my first memory of both a TV news program and celebrity death was when the original His Honor, Mayor Big Richie Daley died of a heart attack in Chicago. December 20th, 1976. I was 6 years and 11 days old. We had a babysitter that night and was a police major at New in DeKalb. She binged the NBC5 News all night as much as she could, and I remember telling my mom and dad excitedly that the major sick is dead when they got back from the hillside or the junction or wherever they went on their date that night. The Windsor Castle fire sticks in my mind. I was 6 years old. I was visiting my grandparents and my family made a big play about how awful it was. We watched all the news coverages because, you know, old British people actually give a shit about the royal family. Like, not to be totally callous, I'm sure it's a genuine downbeat moment in heritage terms and there were minor injuries, but it sort of sticks out more in my mind more for how world-changing it wasn't than compared to all the genuine first major news stories in this thread. Embarrassed smiley face. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann. I remember seeing her photo everywhere and knowing that a girl had gone missing. I got lost in town and was only separated from my parents for a little while, but I was taken into a charity shop and the old ladies running it allowed me to read some books there while someone else looked for my parents because people were scared to allow children to walk around alone for any amount of time. Kurt Cobain and the Shotgun. I was 8. I remember older kids and young adults being very sad. I remember Kurt Loder on MTV breaking down Live. I didn't know of him or Nirvana at the time, but I was still very sad. The next year, it was Jerry Garcia. Didn't know him either, but the loss hit me. Fast forward to me being a lifelong guitarist and I recognize dates in my memory through music album releases and life moments. Mika Hakkinen winning F1 championship. Don't remember what year but remember seeing it in the news. Depending on year I was either 4 or 5. But if that isn't major news then the answer would be 9/11. Episode of Marsupilami was coming from TV and they suddenly cut to news and started to show footage from NY. I was really mad and went to do something else instead of watching dumb news. Was 7 back then. My father went to the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968 when I was 4 and my grandmother and I watched the riots there on TV and I remember her being so worried. But then he came home and brought me exciting presents. He climbed a light pole and filmed the riots from up there. Later his trunk was broken into and those films were stolen. Not his camera or any other films, just those. I remember a handful of things from the mid-90s, like Clinton's speech and Princess Diana's death. But the first time I realized what news was and how newspapers worked was on 9/11 when my dad and I went to get emergency food and what had just been on TV was already on the newspaper at the front of the store. Blew my mind. I grew up to work for that newspaper and was given a copy. I remember a lot but the OJ arrest and car chase were the ones that stuck with me. Also Kurt Cobain's death. My sister cried like a baby like she lost her best friend. I hated their music and culture that came with alternative music. That said, I appreciate a punk rock movement, but not the self-absorbed introverted victim mentality that came with grunge in the 90s. I walked into the kitchen in a flood of tears at the age of 3. When my mother asked what was wrong I told her Elvis was dead. I had no idea who Elvis was, but the black and white TV in the lounge was full of people crying, which set me off. Also remember taking part in the town Jubilee parade which preceded Elvis' death, but can't really remember any media about it. Columbine. Or Princess Diana. I couldn't understand either. I thought Columbine shooters were mad because they had no friends. I always was sad, because I would have been their friend. My mom cried when Princess Diana died, which I thought was weird because I had never even heard of her before then. Like I couldn't understand why mom was crying about a stranger. Challenger. I was in first grade and our class was gathered around the infamous TV on a cart to watch it live. I remember the teacher and her student teacher weeping. Followed very vividly by the Lockerbie bombing. The story of a young boy that landed on a fence and the local women keeping him covered from the elements during the investigation still haunts me. Challenger explosion for sure. And the next one was the Detroit Flight 255 crash. I grew up near there so it was a huge deal. And the story of that little girl that survived it made it more real. Her mom covered her body and took most of the damage. Her brother and father didn't make it. I was 11 at the time and can remember the sick feeling I had. The assassination of President Kennedy. I was 7 years old at the time. I remember watching the horse-drawn carriage carrying the casket down Pennsylvania Avenue. From St. Matthew's Cathedral. John Jr., aged 3 at the time, stepped forward and rendered a final salute as his father's flag-draped casket was carried out from St. Matthew's Cathedral. Martin Luther King Jr. assassination. It must have been the day after because he was shot around 6 p.m. I was in first grade and we all got sent home early because there were riots in NYC schools. Back then we all walked. Nobody lived far enough from the school to need a bus and they assumed the mothers were home, so they just let us go. The Gulf War. I was 6. My dad used to watch the news religiously every night. I saw just enough coverage to start having nightmares. Because of this, my dad sat me down, explained what was happening, that we were safe. They also made sure I saw the news footage of the men coming home after it was all over. We just got a TV in 1961 and all 2 channels were full of Premier Tommy Douglas trying to get the Saskatchewan provincial government to pass the Universal Healthcare Act. It passed, and within a year or so all the other provinces also accepted it. My mom was an MD, so it was a big topic in the house. Kent State. We lived near Akron and the fire sirens were going off all afternoon. And my parents thought nothing of not having the news on while I was playing. Since it happened near us, I was afraid the soldiers would come and shoot us, so I didn't want to go outside. I was not quite 3. The OJ trial when I was about 7 is the first one I really remember seeing on all the magazine covers at the grocery store and hearing all the grown-ups talking about. After that, the murder of JonBenet Ramsey, and the death of Princess Diana were also pretty memorable. Baby Jessica. I was almost 3 at the time. My parents are constantly shocked at the stuff I recall from being a toddler. I also remember the follow-up made-for-TV movie about it, and watching it with my parents. So many during that era, which was the 90s. Death of Princess Diana to 9/11 to this guy Jeremy Strohmeyer who killed a little girl. I remember that vividly because I was talking to the guy before I left to go home, so if I didn't maybe I would have been the victim. Woman shrugging. OJ. I was born in 1985, so was barely forming memories for Challenger and the Berlin Wall. Probably missing something else before then, but OJ felt like the first big news story of my life that I can remember that captivated everyone around me at the time. Challenger disaster. It was a space shuttle that exploded 73 seconds after liftoff on January 28, 1986, killing all 7 crew members on board one. This event was widely covered by the media and had a profound impact on the world, especially the United States. I remember seeing bits of the OJ trial on the news but was way too young to understand what was going on with that, but I also remember some of the coverage of the Oklahoma City bombing and at least understanding, oh that's bad, people got hurt. Cuban Missile Crisis. I thought we were all going to die. Later I found out we almost did. Later it was the Kennedy assassination. They told us at school, but to this day when they break into TV shows with a special report my stomach still drops. I was about 7, but for now at least the first one I can remember being a big thing was Princess Diana dying. I remember not knowing who she was before, but that it felt like every adult I knew could talk of nothing else for weeks afterwards. Aberfan. I was 8 and even then realized how bad it was. 116 children and 28 adults died when a coal tip collapsed into a school in 1966 disaster. OKC bombing. I was 9 and was glued to the TV for a couple days as they continued to rescue people. It hit me hard when after several days, there were no more survivors, only bodies that they didn't manage to reach in time. The Kennedy assassination at 5 years old. My most vivid memory were his 2 years old saluting his father's grave and my mother telling me to watch TV when Oswald got shot. She was very upset and kept saying, "Watch this, it's historic." The OJ Bronco chase being televised live. I remember my parents trying to find something kid-appropriate for my 6-year-old brother and me 10 at the time that evening, but all 5 channels we had at the time were airing The Pursuit. Maybe HIV/AIDS really becoming mainstream news? I was in elementary school when I met my first classmate with HIV. He'd had it transmitted at birth, from what I remember. That would have been around 1990 or so. Not major, but constant. Every day the grown-ups around me watched news about the Vietnam War. Body counts on the nightly news. Kids at school wore POW bracelets. It was the background framework of my childhood, probably the OKC bombing or the OJ trial. I remember the OKC being interesting because of bombs. I didn't really understand the OJ trial and its merits, but I knew that my parents were following it closely. International news. 9/11. In my country, a serial killer called El Descuartizador, the Dismemberer Ripper, another called El Mata Pobre, the poor killer, a dude that killed homeless people. My brother Bill, who joined the Marines at 17, was on a ship to Vietnam, and the news popped up on the TV, said it was over, and we all cheered and cried, including my dad. First time I saw my dad cry, for some reason it's Selena getting murdered. It really impacted me, and I didn't know who she was beforehand. Then, TWA 800. I was so flabbergasted that a plane could just explode like that. SARS outbreak in China. Freaked me out. Dad had to sit down and explain that it was far away and our country wouldn't ever have to deal with that. Cue COVID-19, 20 some odd years later. The first attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. Either that or the disastrous siege of the Branch Davidian cult compound in Waco, Texas. They both happened roughly around the same time. Vaguely remember the OJ verdict. Definitely remember when Princess Diana died. Was old enough to be affected by Columbine and Matt Shepard. Remember all the jokes about Lewinsky too. Challenger explosion. Our entire elementary school was seated in the auditorium to watch as the first teacher aboard a space shuttle was about to blast off into space. I was 7 years old. The fall of Berlin Wall, and also, the Romanian Civil War in '89. I was only 7, but I do remember it very well. My mom used to ship packages full of canned foods and warm clothes. A bus hostage situation in my local country, where the local TV networks broadcast the whole things, essentially giving the hostage taker most of the information outside the bus. The 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake and resulting collapse of a portion of the San Francisco Bay Bridge. I felt the quake, too, but lived far enough away that I wasn't in any danger. Oklahoma City bombing, JonBenet Ramsey murder, Princess Diana's death were some big ones I remember in my childhood. My parents were always tuned into this kind of news.